The rain came down like heaven had opened every cistern at once, and Callum Voss stood knee-deep in what had been a meadow yesterday, squinting through the gray curtain at something that should not have been moving on top of the old fishing shack 100 yards downstream. The river had gone mad in the night. He had heard it from his mill, the grinding roar that woke him before dawn, and by the time he pulled on his boots the mill race was already overflowing, and the wheel stood motionless in a surge that would have torn it from its moorings if he had not chained it fast. Now the whole valley bottom had become a lake, brown and muscled with current, swallowing fence posts and tool sheds, and everything else foolish enough to stand in its way. The shack tilted at an angle, water lapping past the window frames. On the roof 3 shapes huddled together, green skin vivid even through the downpour. An orc woman and 2 children, small enough that they had to be very young. As Callum watched, a wave struck the structure hard enough that the whole building shuddered, and the woman threw her arms around the cubs, shielding them with her body. He did not think. Thinking was for problems with gears and water wheels, questions of ratios and tensions. This was simpler than thinking. He turned and waded back toward the willow that still stood firm on the rise, its roots deep enough to hold against the flood. The rope he kept coiled in his work shed hung from a branch where he had thrown it an hour ago, and he tied one end around the trunk with a bowline his father had taught him 30 years before. The other end went around his waist. He cinched it tight, tested the knot, and walked back into the current. The water rose to his thighs, then his waist. The force of it surprised him, even though he had spent his life reading rivers, understanding their moods and velocities. This was not a river anymore. This was a beast, and it wanted to carry him away with everything else it had claimed. He leaned into it, angling upstream so the current would push him toward the shack rather than past it, each step a negotiation between his weight and the flood's hunger. A submerged stump caught his shin hard enough to make him grunt. He pushed past it. The water climbed to his chest. 20 more yards and the shack seemed no closer, then 10. Then suddenly he was alongside it and reaching up to grab the edge of the roof. The woman stared down at him with eyes the color of dark amber, wide with shock. Her tusks were small, barely protruding past her upper lip, and her black hair hung in ropes across her shoulders. She was not tall, perhaps his own height or a hand shorter, but broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who had worked hard all their life. The 2 cubs pressed against her sides, a boy and a girl, both streaming with rain and shivering. "Can you climb down?" Callum shouted over the roar. She shook her head, frantic, and pointed. He pulled himself higher, boots scrabbling against the tilted wall, and saw what held her. A beam, part of someone's barn or fence, had wedged itself across her left leg, pinning her against the roof peak. The limb was bent at an angle that made his stomach tighten. "The children first," she said. Her voice was hoarse. "Please, take them first." He nodded and held up his arms. She hesitated only a moment before she lifted the boy, a sturdy cub with his mother's amber eyes, and lowered him down. Callum caught him and settled the child against his chest, one arm locked around the small body. "Hold on to me," he said. "Do not let go." The boy's arms went around his neck in a grip that would have choked him if he had not tucked his chin. The trip back was harder with the extra weight, the current trying to swing them both downstream while Callum hauled on the rope, pulling them hand over hand toward the willow. The water surged over his shoulders and the boy whimpered, but did not loosen his hold. The ground rose under his feet in increments, waist deep, then thigh deep, then finally he was wading through the shallows and lifting the boy onto dry grass. The cub stared up at him, water streaming from his blunt nose, and Callum touched his shoulder once before turning back. The second trip took longer. The girl was smaller, lighter, but she was crying and her grip was uncertain. Callum kept talking to her as he crossed the flooded meadow, nonsense words about the mill and the wheel, and how he had a cat who would want to meet her. Anything to keep her focused on his voice instead of the water. She buried her face against his neck, and he felt the hot tears mixing with the cold rain. He set her beside her brother, and they clung to each other, two small shapes against the enormous gray of the storm. Then he went back for the mother. She had shifted position, trying to work her leg free, and blood mixed with the rainwater on the roof. When she saw him coming, she shook her head violently. "It is too heavy," she called. "You cannot lift it alone." "I am not going to lift it," Callum said. He climbed onto the roof, testing each handhold, feeling the whole structure shift beneath him. The water had risen another few inches and now lapped at the peak. Another hour and the shack would go under completely or break apart. He wedged himself above the beam and braced his boots against the roof, then gripped the timber with both hands. "When I lever it up, pull your leg out," he said. "Do not wait to see if you can, just pull." She nodded, teeth gritted. He could see the pain in her face, the exhaustion, but also something else. Determination. Trust, maybe, though he was a stranger and she had no reason to offer that. He wrenched upward with everything he had. The beam shifted, rose half a foot, and the woman dragged her leg free with a sound that was half gasp, half sob. The beam crashed back and Callum nearly went with it, but her hand shot out and grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Can you hold on to me?" he asked. "I can," she said. She was heavier than the children, but she knew how to distribute her weight, how to move with him instead of against him. He got them both into the water and started back toward the willow with her arms around his shoulders, and her breath warm against the side of his face despite the cold rain. The current pulled harder this time, eager for a greater prize, and twice he lost his footing and went under. Both times he held on to the rope, and both times he found the bottom again and kept moving. The willow came closer in pieces, a glimpse of pale bark, then gone behind a sheet of rain. The dark line of the trunk, the children waiting above, small and afraid. Then grass under his boots and the woman sliding down to sit heavily on the ground, her injured legs stretched out in front of her. Callum untied the rope from his waist and stood there breathing hard, rain running into his eyes. The shack gave a long groan behind them and collapsed into the flood, boards scattering like matchsticks. The woman watched it go without expression. Then she looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Speech seemed excessive. The mill was another 200 yards uphill, built on stone foundations high enough that the water would not reach it even if the whole valley drowned. He bent and scooped up the girl, then gestured for the boy to take his hand. "Can you walk?" He asked the woman. She tried to stand and nearly fell. He caught her with his free arm and felt her stiffen, then relax by degrees. "I will manage," she said, but she leaned on him as they made their way up the slope, the four of them moving slowly through the hammering rain toward the dry shelter of the mill. Inside, Callum built up the fire while the orc woman and her children huddled near the hearth, steam rising from their clothes. The mill was a single large room with the grinding mechanism taking up half the space and his living quarters occupying the rest. It smelled of grain dust and wood smoke and the mustiness of a place where a man lived alone without much thought for tidiness. He found blankets and draped them over the children, then set a kettle to boil. The woman watched him with an expression he could not read. Wariness, perhaps. Gratitude. Pain, certainly. Her leg had swollen badly and the skin was mottled with bruising. "I am Daria," she said finally. "Daria Prashar, these are my children, Tolan and Ussa, Callum Voss." He poured hot water into cups and added dried mint. "I run the mill, I know." She took the cup he offered, wrapping both hands around it. "I have seen you, in the village. You sell flour to the merchants." He had seen her too, though he had never spoken to her. The orcs who lived in the valley were few, scattered families who kept to themselves mostly, fishing the river or trapping in the woods. Humans tolerated them in the way people tolerate anything that does not directly threaten their comfort, but the tolerance was thin and turned to hostility with little provocation. "Your husband," Callum said. "Is he still at the shack?" Her face closed. "My husband drowned last spring when the river ran high. There is no one else." The words were flat, meant to forestall sympathy or questions. He accepted them with a nod and turned his attention to her leg instead. When he knelt to examine it, she flinched but did not pull away. "It might be broken," he said. "I cannot tell without a healer. No healer will come for me." It was probably true. He stood and went to the shelf where he kept his sparse medical supplies, things for cuts and splinters and the occasional smashed finger. He brought back a length of clean cloth and a straight piece of board. "I can splint it," he said. "It will hurt. Everything hurts." But she set down the cup and braced herself. He worked as gently as he could, straightening the leg and binding it fast to the board. She made no sound except for a sharp intake of breath when he tightened the final knot. The children watched with enormous eyes, the boy Tolan holding his sister Ussa close. When it was done, Daria sagged back against the wall, her face gray. Callum brought her another cup of the mint tea and this time added a spoonful of honey. She drank it slowly, color returning to her cheeks. Outside, the rain continued. The roar of the flood filled the world, drowning out everything else. Callum fed the fire and put together a meal from what he had on hand, bread and cheese and dried apples, and they ate in near silence. The children devoured their portions and fell asleep almost immediately, curled together under the blankets like puppies. "You should rest too," Callum said. Daria shook her head. "I will keep watch." "For what?" "I do not know." She stared into the fire. "Everything was there in the shack. Everything I had. I thought I could save it. I thought the water would not rise so fast. You were trying to salvage your belongings when the flood came." "I was trying to save the home my husband built." Her voice broke on the words. "I stayed too long. I put my children in danger because I could not let go of boards and nails." "You kept them alive," Callum said. "That is what matters." She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the grief that had not finished with her yet. "Why did you come for us?" she asked. "We are strangers. We are orcs." He considered the question. It seemed to matter to her, the answer, though he was not sure he had one that would satisfy. "I saw you needed help," he said finally. "So I helped." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded slowly and closed her eyes. Within minutes her breathing had deepened into sleep. Callum sat by the fire and listened to the storm. The mill creaked around him, solid and familiar, and he thought about the valley below filling with water, about fences and fields and roads disappearing beneath the flood. In the morning there would be work, more than one man could manage. Bridges to repair, debris to clear, homes to rebuild. But that was tomorrow. Tonight there were 4 people alive who might not have been, and that seemed like enough. The rain lasted 3 days. On the 4th morning Callum woke to silence, the kind that feels heavy after prolonged noise, and opened the mill door to find the water had retreated, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Mud covered everything. Trees stood at odd angles, their roots exposed. The road had become a creek, cutting new channels through the softened earth. Daria's leg was improving slowly. She could put weight on it for short periods, and the swelling had gone down enough that Callum adjusted the splint. The children had recovered their spirits with the resilience of the young, and they explored the mill with fascination. asking questions about the wheel and the stones and how flour was made. Tolan was 6, Callum learned, and Ussa 4. They were polite and curious, and attached themselves to him with a trust that was both touching and terrifying. He had never been around children much. His marriage had been brief and childless, ending when his wife decided she preferred the city to the isolation of mill life. And in the years since he had grown accustomed to solitude, now the mill was full of noise and motion. Ussa sang to herself while she played with Callum's cat, a battered orange Tom who had appeared one winter and never left. Tolan followed Callum everywhere, watching intently as he checked the wheel mechanism and cleared debris from the mill race. Daria watched too, but from a distance, and Callum could feel her measuring him, trying to understand what he wanted in return for his help. He wanted nothing, but he did not know how to convince her of that. Trust was not built with words. On the 5th day, a group of men from the village came up the road, wading through the mud. Callum met them outside. Their leader was a farmer named Boren, a thick man with a suspicious face. "We saw smoke from your chimney," Boren said. "Wanted to make sure you were all right." "I am fine." "Good, good." Boren glanced past him toward the mill door. "We heard you pulled some people out of the flood. Orcs." "A woman and her children," Callum said. "They were trapped." "That is generous of you." Boren's tone suggested it was anything but, "When are they leaving?" "When they can travel safely." "The village has concerns, Voss. Orcs living up here in your mill. People are nervous." Callum looked at him steadily. "They are not living here. They are recovering from injury. When the woman is healed, they will go. See that they do." Boren turned to leave, then paused. "There is another matter. The dam downstream, the one that protects the lower fields, it is strained. The water behind it is still too high. If it breaks, the whole village floods. What do you need?" "Every able man to help shore it up. We are going down now." Callum nodded. "I will come." He went inside to tell Daria where he was going. She was sitting by the fire, working a piece of leather with a bone needle, mending one of Tolan's boots. Her hand stilled when he explained about the dam. "I know that dam," she said. "I have fished those waters since I was a child. The structure is old. If the water is high, sandbagging will not be enough." "What would you suggest?" She hesitated. "Let me come with you. I cannot work, but I can advise. You can barely walk. I can ride." She gestured to the crutch Callum had fashioned from a branch. "And I know water better than any human in that village." He wanted to argue, to tell her she needed rest, but the determination in her face stopped him. This mattered to her, the chance to be useful instead of helpless. "All right," he said, "but the children stay here." They took his cart, Daria sitting in the back with her splinted legs stretched out, Callum walking alongside the mule that pulled them. The road was nearly impassable in places, and twice they had to dismount and clear fallen branches before they could continue. The dam was a low earthwork structure reinforced with timber, built decades ago to control spring flooding. Water pressed against it in a dark mass, higher than Callum had ever seen. Men swarmed over the face of the dam with sacks of sand and gravel, working frantically to build up the weakest sections. Boren saw them coming and his face darkened. "I did not invite the orc." "She knows water," Callum said. "She is here to help. We do not need her kind of help." Daria climbed down from the cart with difficulty and stood balanced on her crutch, surveying the dam. Callum watched her face change as she read the situation, saw the problem the men could not see. "You are reinforcing the wrong section," she said. Every head turned. Boren's face flushed red. "What did you say? The water is highest there, yes, but the foundation is sound. The weak point is there." She pointed to a spot 30 feet to the left where the face of the dam looked unchanged. "The seepage pattern tells you where the erosion is worst. If you do not shore that section, The dam will fail within hours. You think you know better than men who built this dam? Boren demanded. I know better than men who are about to let it break. Her voice was calm, factual, without challenge. You can listen or you can lose the village. I do not care which. Callum walked to the spot she had indicated and knelt in the mud. Water was indeed seeping through the earthwork there, a steady weeping that had softened the ground. He pressed his hand against the dam face and felt it give slightly. The structure weakened from behind. She is right, he called. This whole section is compromised. There was a moment of tense silence. Then one of the younger men, a cooper's son, grabbed his sandbag and moved to where Callum knelt. Another followed. Then another. Boren stood rigid for a long moment before he too came over, moving stiffly, and began directing the work. Daria stayed on the bank and called out instructions, telling them where to place the bags, how to angle them to redirect the pressure, when to pack gravel instead of sand. The men listened, grudgingly at first and then with growing respect as they saw her knowledge was genuine. The work took all day. By the time the sun set, the critical section was reinforced and the seepage had stopped. The dam would hold, at least through the remaining high water. Boren approached the cart as Callum was helping Daria back into it. The farmer's face was still suspicious, but some of the hostility had faded. You were right about the weak point, he said to Daria. She nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without comment. Where will you go? Boren asked. When you leave the mill? I do not know yet. The fishing shack is gone. I know. Boren shifted his weight. There is work in the village, for those who are useful. He turned and walked away before she could respond. On the ride back to the mill, Daria was quiet. Callum glanced at her once and saw she was crying silently, tears running down her green cheeks. He said nothing. Some grief needed no witness, no comfort, only space to exist. The days became weeks. Spring turned toward summer and the valley slowly recovered its shape. Callum worked to repair the mill race and get the wheel turning again. Daria's leg healed enough that she could walk without the crutch, though she still limped. The children grew brown in the sun, playing in the yard while their mother helped with tasks she could manage, sorting grain, mending sacks, keeping the living quarters cleaner than they had been in years. It was a temporary arrangement, Callum told himself. As soon as Daria was strong enough, they would leave. She would find a place in the village or move to another settlement where the fishing was good. Life would return to the way it had been, solitary and predictable, but he found himself reluctant to raise the subject. The mill felt different now, fuller, and not just because of the extra bodies. There was laughter in the evenings when Ussa convinced him to play simple games with her. There were questions from Tolan about how things worked, questions that showed a quick mind and a mechanical aptitude that reminded Callum of himself at that age. There was Daria, moving through the space with quiet competence, cooking meals that were better than anything he had bothered to make for himself, humming old songs while she worked. He caught himself watching her sometimes. The way she plaited Ussa's hair with gentle efficiency. The way she stood in the doorway at dawn, looking out at the river with an expression of longing and fear mixed together. The way she smiled, rarely but genuinely, when one of the children did something that pleased her. She was not beautiful in the way human women were beautiful, but there was something compelling about her face, the strong lines of it, the directness of her gaze. And there was strength in her, a core of resilience that had survived loss and hardship and kept bending toward the light. He was falling in love with her, Callum realized one evening as he watched her teach Tolan to tie a fishing knot. The knowledge came quietly, without drama, a simple recognition of what had been building for weeks. It was a foolish thing to feel. She was orc and he was human, and the world had no patience for such crossings. She would leave soon and he would stay, and that would be the end of it. But the feeling did not care about wisdom. It simply was. Summer came in earnest. The mill was running again, farmers bringing grain from fields that had survived the flood. Callum worked long days, and Daria and the children worked alongside him. Tolan learned to sweep the millstones clean of chaff. Ussa helped bag flour, her small hands careful with the scoops. Daria kept the books, tallying sales with a neat hand. She had learned letters from her husband, she told Callum, and she was teaching both children to read using an old almanac she had found on the shelf. One evening in late summer, Callum found her sitting outside on the bench he had built near the mill race, watching the water turn the wheel. Her leg was fully healed now, though she still favored it when the weather turned damp. "The children are asleep," she said when he sat down beside her. "They worked hard today. They like it here." She paused. "They like you, I like them. You have been very kind to us, Callum. I do not know how to repay that. There is nothing to repay." She turned to look at him, her amber eyes catching the last of the evening light. "I should go. Find a place of our own. I have been here too long already. You can stay as long as you need." "Can I?" The question was gentle, probing. "People in the village are talking. I hear the things they say when I go to market, about the human miller who keeps an orc woman in his home." "Let them talk. It will hurt you, your business, your reputation." "My business is fine. My reputation was never that interesting to begin with." She smiled slightly at that, then the smile faded. "I am afraid of the water again. I thought I had made peace with it after my husband died, but the flood brought all the fear back. I stand by this race every day and I feel my heart pound. I think of Tolan and Ussa on that roof and how close it was, how easily they could have been swept away." "But they were not," Callum said. "Because of you. Because I happened to be looking in the right direction." "No," she shook her head. "Because you are the kind of man who wades into floods for strangers. There are not many such men." He had no answer for that. They sat in silence, listening to the steady rush of water over the wheel. The sky darkened and stars came out, more than could ever be seen in the city, a whole river of light overhead. "I do not want to leave," Daria said finally, so quietly he almost missed it. "I want to stay here, with you. I want my children to grow up in this place. I want to stop being afraid." Callum felt his heart kick against his ribs. "Then stay. You do not understand what you are asking. The villagers will not accept it. They tolerate me now because I helped save the dam, but if I live here permanently, as your—" She stopped, the word unspoken. "As my wife," Callum said. She stared at him. "You cannot mean that. Why not?" "Because I am orc. Because you deserve better than a widow with 2 children and a limp." Because he stopped her with a hand on her arm, gentle but firm. "I mean it. I have thought about nothing else for weeks. I want you to stay, all 3 of you, not as guests, as family." "Callum." His name in her mouth sounded like a prayer. "You are offering me everything. But what do I give you in return? A hard life, prejudice, isolation." "You give me yourself," he said. "You give me laughter in my home and purpose in my days. You give me Tolan and Ussa and the chance to be a father. That is not nothing." She reached out and touched his face, her rough palm against his cheek. "I am terrified," she whispered, "of wanting this too much. Then we will be terrified together." She leaned forward and kissed him, and it was not the first kiss of a romance but the deep kiss of 2 people who had already chosen each other, who had been choosing each other in small ways for months. When they pulled apart, she was crying again, but this time she was smiling too. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will stay. Yes, I will marry you." They were wed a week later in the mill with only the children as witnesses. No priest would perform the ceremony, so they wrote their own vows and spoke them to each other beside the turning wheel. Callum promised to care for Daria and her children, to stand beside her against whatever came. Daria promised to build a life with him, to face her fear of the water, to let him into the guarded places of her heart. Tolan and Ussa made crowns of river willow and placed them on their heads, solemn and delighted in equal measure. The cat wound around their ankles, purring. The wheel turned and the grain ground into flour, and the world outside went on not caring and not needing to care. The village reacted as expected. Some families stopped bringing grain to the mill. Others came but would not speak to Daria, conducting all business through Callum. There were ugly words occasionally, and once someone left a dead crow nailed to the door. But there were also farmers who nodded to Daria in the market, remembering the dam. There was the cooper's son who brought toys he had carved for Tolan and Ussa. There was the slow, grudging acceptance of people who had more important things to worry about than who shared a miller's bed. Through it all, Callum and Daria built their life together. He taught her the mechanisms of the mill, the ratios and tensions he had always understood instinctively, and discovered she had a gift for it. She could hear imbalances in the wheel's rotation that he would have missed, could diagnose problems with the stones before they became serious. She taught him the river, how to read the currents, where the fish ran deep. She took him into the water on a warm autumn day and held his hand while her own fear shook through her. And together they stood in the shallows until the panic passed, and she could breathe again. Tolan learned the trade, his small hands growing skilled with tools. Ussa learned letters and numbers and how to bake bread. Both children stopped flinching when strangers approached. Both learned to call Callum by name, and then one winter evening Tolan called him father instead, tentative, testing the word. Callum looked at Daria, who nodded permission through sudden tears. "Yes," he said to the boy, "I am your father now." The years turned, the mill prospered. A second flood came, smaller than the first, and this time Daria did not freeze with fear but worked alongside Callum to secure the wheel and protect the grain stores. When the water receded, she waded in without hesitation, checking the foundation for damage. "I am not afraid anymore," she told him that night. "I know," he said, and kissed the top of her head. On an autumn morning 5 years after the rescue, Callum and Daria stood with Tolan and Ussa on the bank where the fishing shack had once been. They had rebuilt it over the previous months, not as a shack, but as a small, sturdy house with a stone foundation and a pitched roof. The structure sat well above the flood line, and Daria had insisted on double reinforcing every joint. Now they gathered to plant a garden on the reclaimed bank, the 4 of them working together to turn the earth and mark out rows. Tolan, 11 now and tall for his age, handled the spade with practiced competence. Ussa, 9 and chattering constantly, planned where the beans would go and where the squash. Daria knelt in the dirt, her hands deep in the soil, and Callum knelt beside her. The river ran calm and clear beyond the garden, no longer an enemy but simply water, flowing as it had always flowed. "Are you happy?" he asked her. She looked at him, her face weathered now, lines at the corners of her eyes from years of smiling. "I am happy," she said. "I did not think I would ever be happy again after I lost my first husband. I thought that part of my life was over. But you gave me a second chance. We gave each other a second chance." "Yes." She reached over and laced her muddy fingers through his. "We did." Tolan called out a question about where to put the fence posts, and Callum rose to help him. But he looked back once at Daria. Still kneeling in the garden she was planting in soil that had been underwater when they met. The house stood solid behind her. The river flowed beside her. Their children worked nearby, safe and whole and growing into themselves. It was not the life Callum had imagined when he was young, but it was the life he had now, and he would not trade it for any other. The sun climbed higher. They worked through the morning, planting seeds that would grow into food for the winter, roots that would hold the earth firm when the spring floods came again. Because the floods would come. That was the nature of rivers, to rise and fall and reshape the land. But Callum and Daria had learned to build on high ground. They had learned to read the water, to respect its power, to work with it instead of against it. They had learned that family was not always made of blood, but sometimes of choice, of hands reaching across divides that were supposed to be uncrossable. They had learned that rescue was not a single moment, but a mutual practice, something that happened again and again in small daily ways. He had waded into a flood to carry them to safety. She had waded into trust to carry them to happiness. And now they stood together on solid ground, planting a future. By afternoon, the garden was planted and marked with small stakes that Ussa had decorated with scraps of cloth. They walked back to the mill along the river path, Tolan and Ussa running ahead to see who could spot the most birds. Daria limped slightly still when she was tired, and Callum slowed his pace to match hers. "You think the children remember?" she asked. "The flood, being trapped?" "Tolan does, I think. Ussa was so young it might just be a story to her now. I remember every moment of it, the water rising, the beam falling, the certainty that we were going to die." She squeezed his hand. "And then I remember you climbing up through the flood like something out of a legend. I thought I was hallucinating. I thought the water had driven me mad and I was seeing what I wanted to see instead of what was real. I am very real." "Yes," she smiled. "You are, and thank all the gods for that." They reached the mill as the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Smoke rose from the chimney where they had left a stew cooking. The wheel turned steadily, a sound so familiar now that Callum only noticed it when it stopped. This was home. Not just the building, but the people in it, the life they had made together from pieces of wreckage and hope. It was imperfect and beautiful and entirely theirs. Inside, they ate together at the long table Callum had built when he realized 4 people needed more space than one. They talked about the garden, about the seeds, about whether the frost would come early this year. Ordinary things, comfortable things. After the meal, Ussa begged for a story and Daria told one about a clever fisher who outwitted a river spirit. Tolan listened with the kind attention of a child who had heard the tale many times but never tired of it. Callum cleaned the dishes and listened too, to the cadence of Daria's voice, the way she changed tone for different characters. When the children were finally in bed, he and Daria sat by the fire as they did most evenings. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they watched the flames in silence. "I used to think," Daria said after a while, "that strength meant not being afraid. My first husband was like that, fearless. He would go out on the river in any weather, take any risk, and the river killed him for it." "Strength is knowing when to be afraid," Callum said. "Yes, and doing what needs to be done anyway." She tilted her head to look up at him. "You taught me that. On the dam, and every day since. You already knew it, you just needed reminding. Perhaps." She was quiet for a moment. "I am glad you looked in the right direction that day. I am glad you saw us. So am I. Even with all the trouble it brought you. The lost customers, the suspicion, the constant sense of being watched and judged, even with all that." She kissed him then, soft and sure, and he felt the same surge of gratitude he always felt, that she was here, that she had chosen to stay, that they had found each other in the chaos of rising water and built something that could withstand any storm. The fire burned low. Outside, the wheel turned and the river ran and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside, 2 people who had been strangers held each other in the warmth, while their children slept safe in the next room. This was not a story about a dramatic rescue, though it had begun with one. It was a story about what came after, about healing and trust and the slow, patient work of building a life with another person, about learning to be a father to children who needed one, about learning to trust water again and people and possibility. It was a story about love, yes, but not the sudden blazing kind that consumed and faded. This was the other kind, the steady kind, the kind that grew deeper year by year, that weathered trouble and came out stronger, that took root in good soil and refused to be torn away. Callum and Daria fell asleep by the fire that night, wrapped in blankets, wrapped in each other. And in the morning they would wake and begin again, the endless, ordinary miracle of days spent together. The flood that had brought them together was years behind them now, but its lesson remained. That sometimes disaster was also opportunity. That sometimes the water rose so you could find higher ground. That sometimes you had to lose everything before you understood what truly mattered. And sometimes a man waded into a flood and carried a family to safety, and in doing so found the family he had been missing all along. The wheel turned. The river flowed. The mill stood firm on its foundation. And 4 people who had been broken pieces became whole together, in a place where the water ran clear, and the work was honest and love was possible despite everything the world said to the contrary. This was their story. This was their life. And it was, in all the ways that mattered, exactly enough.